Stanford University sits at the confluence of technical brilliance, venture capital, and outright fraud. It is arguably the most elite academic institution in the world, a place where students are recruited to found billion-dollar companies before they've finished their first semester, where some professors own a different Ferrari for every day of the week, and where oligarch yacht soirees and all-night codathons are as mandatory as reciting land acknowledgments before gaining entrance to a frat party. It's where the fraudulent neuroscientist Andrew Huberman still occasionally holds court, and where Peter Thiel and Sam Altman personally come to recruit talent. On today's show, I have the great pleasure of welcoming a recent Stanford graduate who has been reporting from the inside of the university for the last 4 years. Theo Baker is the youngest ever recipient of the Polk Award for Investigative Journalism. In his first semester, he exposed how Stanford's president, Mark Tessier-Lavigne, had published research containing fabricated data. He connected the dots between the pharmaceutical giant Genentech and Tessier-Lavigne's earlier career, and his work ultimately forced the president to resign. Along the way, he was threatened by Stanford's legal team and faced with the wrath of social media commenters, all the while struggling to compete one of the most grueling computer science courses in America. His book, How to Rule the World, has just been released and appears likely to land on the New York Times bestseller list. Fellow investigative journalists have called him a fucking menace, which is high praise on this channel. Welcome to the show, Theo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
I got this book only like 4 days ago, and I had to devour it because I knew we were going to chat. And there's just so much great material in it. And I've been a watchdog at Stanford for a long time, worried about the VC pipeline. And then, I interviewed Elizabeth Bick a little bit early, a year or so ago. And I've always wanted to dig in more. And then I found your book. I was like, great, you already did it. So now we're going to talk about it. The first place I want to start is, can you describe for me the Stanford inside of Stanford?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to understand that Stanford is less a school than it is a business, right? This is a place that has a budget higher than 116 countries. And the product that they're selling is students. Students are the thing that you can make your money off of. They are how you're going to extract a reward for having, created this incredible ecosystem. You will get kicked back, the amount of money that you invest in them, 10 or 1,000 times fold, when they create the next trillion-dollar companies, right? Both of the most valuable companies in the world right now, Alphabet and NVIDIA, were founded by Stanford alumni, grew out of this university. And so the logical end result of that logic, right? The logical end result of believing that students are a monetizable commodity is what is known as the Stanford inside Stanford. And the Stanford inside Stanford is the group of, the few dozen students who are tapped on the shoulder and identified very early on as the next trillion-dollar startup founders. And for them, there's a complete parallel reality where they are foisted with excess and access. There's even something called pre-idea funding.
Which is insane, right? Pre-idea funding. It's like, what the hell are you funding? And at some point, you were actually tapped on the shoulder, and I think it was an early investigation into could Theo become the next billion-dollar startup person. What was it like to negotiate that elitism and to see the beginnings of that journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. I never really got beyond like kid with potential. I came into Stanford thinking I was going to be a computer science kid. That's what I spent all my time in high school doing. I was, the kid who would build a machine learning model from scratch in my bedroom in high school. And that was like, the peak Friday night. And I very quickly over freshman year, I sort of became an accidental investigative journalist. And so things sort of changed. But I had the experience of going through sort of the first step and meeting some of these people. I remember there's this one CEO who started a billion-dollar company who reached out to me cold freshman year. And he invites me out to brunch at the Rosewood Hotel, which markets itself as, the modern clubhouse for Silicon Valley is the tagline. And so he's sitting there spoon feeding his 8-month-old caviar as he confesses that his first ever contract was for Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator. And it's just the casualness of misdeed in this place is astonishing. That once you are in the system, once you are in this inner world, people will confess to all sorts of absurd things. And it's sort of kept closed off and necessarily from the rest of the world.
You were tapped into this and you were sort of brought into a group, which was called How to Rule the World, right? Which I didn't quite understand if that was an official class or if this was just like another club you were in. But they're like really actively trying to identify you when you're 17 years old, right? You're 17. You are,
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't trust a 17-year-old with much at all. And yet they're coming to you dumping money on you. And how does that make you feel as one of these students?
Well, if you think about it this way, right, Silicon Valley, by some metrics, is the greatest creation and concentration of wealth in human history. And the resource that people are trying to mine in this modern day gold rush is talent. They're trying to mine talent. And so these kids who are coming onto Stanford's campus as freshmen, as 17 or 18-year-olds, are the freshest, most pure, raw expressions of talent. And so the earlier you get your hooks into them, when you find the next Instagram or Snapchat or whatnot, before it even exists, the more you've made your own career. And so that's why these adults have created this entire ecosystem around extracting value from teenagers. How to Rule the World, this secret seminar for 12 students a year that exists once a week on Stanford's campus in the winter quarter, is sort of the ultimate expression of that.
Do you feel like, there's a question with college admissions, right? Is that, Harvard, for instance, another great university. Everyone says Harvard is the best, but really you've selected a group of people and then you've given them infinite resources. And then those people go on to do great things. Surprise, surprise. And how much do you feel, as a student who was there, that this is, that are these people actually special, or is it mostly posturing and therefore a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Well, it's a mixture of both, right? That many of the people who are in the Stanford Inside Stanford are genuinely brilliant coders, and they are very talented and very impressive minds. And also, Silicon Valley likes to preach meritocracy as the end all and be all, and that's not how this system works. As I very clearly discovered in the 250 interviews I did for this book, the real entree to success is knowing the right person, is being tapped on the shoulder, is finding a disguised entry point. As one investor put it to me, his job is to separate out the quote unquote wantrepreneurs from the quote unquote builders. Builder being the fetishized term that's applied to those who have the real special raw talent. And that's because so many people now come here thinking they can be the next tech Jesus that it's become harder and harder to sort through who's doing it just because they want the money or because they actually have whatever is that special makeup, that alchemy that makes you a successful founder.
And those connections are really, I think, quite important because, the Stanford has, as you write, the richest professoriate in the world. And that is not something, you don't usually find professors who are ridiculously wealthy. They
Yeah.
are the outlier, but there's a lot of them. You have billionaire professors on
Professor
campus.
Billionaire is the moniker. Yeah, he goes by Professor Billionaire, which is great.
So how does that happen? Like why is it that these academics become so wealthy?
It's not an accident. This is Stanford's intentional Faustian bargain with Silicon Valley. It's the thing that has made it rich. It's the thing that has allowed it to ascend, to greater heights in the last few decades than any other institution of higher education, has not had the trajectory that Stanford has had, right? It used to be this sort of regional underdog, and now it's this global powerhouse, on the top of the world, arguably the best or close to it university in the world. And that happened, because of an intentional refocus that began, first of all, after World War II. Fred Terman creates what he calls the private partner, the private public academic partnership that now every university seems to have. He brought these companies into the Stanford Research Park, and that's where Silicon Valley was created. The early tech giant Sun Microsystems was literally named for Stanford University Network, right? Silicon Valley wouldn't exist without Stanford. And if you actually just sum the value of the companies that have offices on Stanford's campus, it's somewhere north of $6 trillion, right? And so that's what makes it very different than the Ivy League, which we all know for its excesses and its pipeline into Wall Street and DC, right? That's a real thing. This is so much more entangled because Stanford and Silicon Valley couldn't exist without the other.
It puts a lot of pressure on the students and also the scientific research, right? When we go into Stanford, when we look at it and you're a student there, there's sort of this impression that you have to start pitching your next billion dollar company. You have to sort of be that next person. And then we also see a lot of research at Stanford where people, obviously you're going to go from research paper to big idea, right? To company in an ideal case. Sometimes you do it without the research paper. This leads to certain conflicts of interest, right? Like, how do you ensure that you really do have the good thing? And we can look at like various initiatives at Stanford, whether it's, I've seen some really weird climate change, climate sequestration technology startups that are coming out of there that actually don't seem to have the technical sides behind it. You're selling an idea. How does that change the results?
No, you've hit on something very important. Absolutely, right? That the incentive structure here is aligned toward making these very, very big promises, and doesn't have the sort of system that calls for guardrails and accountability and transparency to follow up when things go wrong. And that's the thing, right? Justin teaches in this secret class, How to Rule the World, which I report on in the book. He teaches about exceeding the limits of your conceivable ambition. And that in and of itself is not an evil thing, right? Big thinking is what leads to big results. The problem is when you have big thinking divorced from reality and you don't have, the ability to call people out, the culture that calls people out when they do things that are wrong. And I watched this happen with the freshmen, some of the freshmen that I arrived with who were brilliant and idealistic and I do believe genuinely committed to technology. And they learn how to play the game. They learn, in the words of Justin, how to extract value from people. They learn that they can make promises to VCs and misrepresent themselves and get money off of it, millions of dollars. They learn, one of the kids I arrived with learns how to fake a launch demo and gets feted by all of Silicon Valley for this brilliant new company that doesn't have the technology she says it has. And so if you want to understand, right, why things go wrong, it's not just that there are some bad eggs. It's that there's an incentive structure that rewards this behavior again and again.
In some ways, on my channel, I talk a lot about wellness grifters, like the entire universe of
Yeah.
wellness grifters. And you write about one very notable one in your book, a guy named Tony Robbins, right? Where
Yeah.
we sell this idea about curing your health ailments with our protocol, our pill, our X, Y, and Z. It iterates in a lot of different ways. It seems to me that that is exceptionally it's almost like Stanford has perfected this pitch. And that is really what they're selling because the VCs don't always necessarily have to sell something that works in order to make a ridiculous amount of money.
Yeah, I mean, the dirty truth about venture capitalists is that they're very bad at their jobs, right? About 2% of VCs generate 95% of the entire industry's returns, right? So most people are just going where they see the herd headed. They're trend followers, not trend setters, as much as they try to proclaim themselves as being. And so right now, AI is the thing. Anything with AI in the name will get funded. The guy who taught me how to shotgun a beer freshman year drops out 6 months after he starts his company with AI in the name. It's valued at over $1 billion, which is more than $80 million per employee of the company, by the way, because they're a tiny, tiny team, 6 months into their existence. And by the way, I think that guy could succeed. Like, he's one of the smartest people I know. If anyone could do it, it's him. There's so many others I saw raise money, with absolutely no glimmer of any kind of success in sight. This is the rise of the rapper startup. I'm sure is a term that's familiar to you, right? These companies that have no technology of their own are just reskinning these models. They lose money every time you use their free service. And yet, Perplexity, for example, is one that was started, I think the same month that I arrived at Stanford, now valued at $20 billion. And for what? For what reason, right? And so this is the thing in Silicon Valley, like the line between acceptable reality distortion, as they put it, and fraud is very thin. And much of it has to do with whether or not you win. Journalists like myself, like we tend to think of Reddit as one of the better social media companies. Reddit's founders admitted that they made up all their user data for like the first year and a half, right? And we don't talk about that because they did win. And so that's the mentality that I see at Stanford. It's in the words of one of my colleagues as we were working on running the school's hackathon in freshman year. We have hundreds of thousands of dollars that corporate sponsors have given us with no contracts or strings attached or any sort of oversight. She's talking about all the things, the mishigas that inevitably results. And she says, it's all just a little bit of fraud. Just a little bit of fraud has become baked in.
So Stanford has a history of amazing research, right? And DNA was found at Stanford mostly. And But we also have, instead of these little bits of fraud, you also have some of the biggest fraudsters in scientific history also come out of Stanford, or at least attached to Stanford. I mean, Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, SBF, and, let's just put Mark Tessier-Levine there as well. You've already touched on this. Why does Stanford produce so many frauds? But how is this enabled, and what does that mean for the overall ecosystem between venture
Okay.
capital and things that work in the world that make the world an actual better place?
Yeah, look, even literally the day that I announced this book that I've written and reported about fraud and this ecosystem at Stanford and whatnot. Literally that very same day, Do Kwon, a Stanford alum whose company grew out of ideas he had at this school, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for a multi-billion-dollar crypto fraud. Right? It is something that is become really part and parcel of how things work in Silicon Valley. And there's a reason for that. And this is the thing I want people to understand, that Elizabeth Holmes is just as much a product of this university as Hewlett or Packard, right? That you can't just have the good and never talk about the bad, that they are the result of the same incentive structure, right? And so this thing that works very well sometimes, that does create unimaginable innovation and progress that really is special. Stanford really is a special place with incredible attributes that can be an incredible place to be as a student. At the same time, has allowed for its corruption, by the very same token, by the very same things that have allowed it to ascend to this prominent position. And so the reason that this keeps happening again and again, in my view, and in the view of many of the people I spoke with, it comes back to the lack of transparency. It comes back to this appearance über alles mindset where things can only ever look good. The good things, as one professor put it to me, we overclaim them. We puff them up and make them bigger than they would be elsewhere. And the bad things, well, we just don't talk about those.
And maybe you're even encouraged to do the bad things. It seems like the result, like making money at all costs, if you get away with it. I mean, wasn't there a part in this book where you're talking about ethics in one of your in your entrepreneurial classes, and you raise the point that why are there so many frauds, and the main question of your students, as I recall from your book, was that they were like, well, how did they got caught? Like, how do we get away with it? What's the best way to avoid that outcome?
Well, certainly. And there are a lot of people, I remember I arrived on campus at a very interesting time, right? So this was right at the zenith of the crypto craze. Everyone thought they were going to make their money off of that. And then about a month in, Sam Bankman-Fried comes collapsing, in his fall from grace. And so people are trying to pivot. And I remember I was at a dinner party hosted by, this investor who spends more time around teenagers than his own family, it seems. And he is sitting there, and I'm sitting across the table from one of the biggest crypto boosters on campus. And he says, well, SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, well, he was directionally correct, he says, directionally correct. And it's terrible. Building is just halted now. We're all trying to figure out what's the legality. How can we get around this? Stanford strivers were looking for the new path to get rich now that this one had come crashing down. And then lo and behold, by the end of the month, ChatGPT comes out and everyone is rushing toward anything with AI in the name. And the sums of money are unfathomable. Unfathomable. It's astonishing. That when I arrived on campus, NVIDIA still had a lower server share, a share of the server market that Intel did. By junior year, Jensen Huang, the Stanford alum, in whose auditorium, by the way, I took my first ever coding class, Jensen Huang alone himself was worth more than the entire company Intel.
And like, how many of these students are coming into their freshman year and coming out millionaires before they go anywhere?
Well, and this is the thing, right? There are, these recruiters who one of my friends described as sort of assassins in how they recruit people, which I thought was a particularly sort of delicious, phrase for that. I watched a lot of these kids I knew in the Stanford Inside Stanford get headhunted and drop out, and they're fielding $600,000 minimum salaries. Now many of them who went to work at Anthropic or OpenAI have eight-figure net worths themselves at age 21 or 22, which is really hard to think about because those are just the employees. Those aren't even the ones who are doing the startups. And it's so fascinating because AI is this great accelerant, right? It takes the trends that are already brimming beneath the surface and it makes them far more pronounced. The cheating thing, well, that's everywhere now, right? Everyone is cheating on everything, it seems like, to a certain degree. And that's partly because Stanford has created, the talk about incentive structures, right? Here, education is no longer the first priority. It's whether you're going to come out, having a high paying job, or whether you're going to get rich. For a lot of people, that's the priority, not your education itself. So it makes sense why they're cutting corners when it comes to their actual classwork, and at the same time, it's made it so that the most valuable researchers are more valuable than ever before, while the entry level positions are being drawn up. The ladder is being drawn up in front of most people. So Stanford, for the first time in 2 decades, saw its computer science enrollment shrink last year, right? And sort of a common refrain among the Stanford Inside Stanford is that it's easier now to raise money for a startup than it is to get an internship.
I totally believe that. Wow. I think you wrote a New York Times piece recently, or it looked like it was an excerpt from the book, but I actually didn't see the material mentioned in the book, and it was around this idea of cheating, which is where you'd said that when you started, you took this intro computer science course, which was very difficult. It was sort of that standout, weed out course where you're answering all these difficult questions, and then just 3 years later, people are acing those impossible exams by using AI and ChatGPT, and they just breeze through. So it seems like this cheating is now like the ethic to get anywhere.
I mean, it's definitely become baked in a way that is really hard to talk about because it's so widespread. I mean, people, I think, have a sense of the problem, but it's astonishing to watch it up close and personal. To see the kid in your seminar, like, literally asking ChatGPT what to speak up and say at this class, where, by the way, it's not a cheap thing to go to Stanford. Like, Stanford has generous financial aid, and I think 72% of students receive some form of assistance, but it's still like a big burden, and it's a big thing to get to go to a school like this. And you're watching kids, in their discussion lectures, asking AI what to say instead of thinking themselves, like, what's the point of being here? And yet, at the same time, like, you can't blame it all on the kids, because it is, sort of an extension of the behavior that has been incentivized by these schools, which have made self-presentation the end all and be all, which have made, your end result, as opposed to your, intellectual and vigorous, whatever, education, for its own self. They have made that the end result. The end result, how you emerge from this place, is the only thing that matters.
How much is Stanford interested in setting trends versus chasing trends? I mean, you mentioned that it was crypto. Everyone was talking about crypto. The whole world was talking about crypto. SBF, comes in, and then we have this resurgence of AI, this interest in AI. You could say also resurgence because it was a big deal years and years
Mm.
ago. Um, but now, and then everyone's chasing AI. Are people actually looking at the next big grift right now? Is there any truly brilliant student who says, no, no, it's all going to be about jellyfish tentacles? I tell you, it's going to be about jellyfish tentacles. Is that going on at all there right now?
Of course, yeah. And, I think one of the things that was really big when I first touched down on campus, in addition to crypto, is like solid state battery tech and, the climate solutions and stuff. But that's the other thing, right? Stanford has become this sprawling, massive institution. Not only is its budget higher than 116 countries, which is, I think I said that already, right? But it's also a place that functions at once as a hedge fund controlling billions of dollars, as, the site for ordinary teenage exploration and coming of age, as a repository of historical thought and knowledge, as a scientific lab on steroids with billions of dollars in funding, as a professional sports league, as a brand, with merchandising deals that are worth a huge amount of money. It's also a hospital system. It's all of these things under one umbrella, and those don't fit neatly, inside the same identity. Right. And so that's part of the problem that Stanford, has really been faced with in recent years. What is it? What is this place? What does it stand for? Does it have any core values? And that problem, which is central to Stanford, is certainly one that we see replicated, I would say, across a lot of higher education in the last few years.
One of the most prominent Stanford faces right now is the neuroscientist Andrew Huberman. What is your interaction or view of how he integrates with the Stanford world? I know he was not mentioned in your book, but he sort of has he seems to have a role where he interviews all the brightest minds and sees the next thing. And he's sort of an outgrowth of this. What has been your experience or knowledge of that side of Stanford?
Yeah. Well, so I don't know too much about Andrew Huberman in particular. I mean, I think I read that New York Magazine piece a couple of years ago when it came out, but um, I haven't kept up too closely with the particulars. I will say that celebrity academic is certainly a big thing at Stanford, right? You can monetize your position here in various different ways, in very clever ways, honestly. Like you have to give it to people. Sometimes they will set up these consultancy companies, right? So you can funnel a large amount of the contracts that you're getting from the government or from private sources into your own pocket. And that's, what supposedly the former department chair with the Ferrari for every day of the week that you mentioned, that's apparently how he makes his fortune. There are other people, the guy who's rubber stamping Tony Robbins' research that you mentioned earlier. Tony Robbins says that his research, he can cure your mental health condition, and it's all been validated 100% by the Snyder Lab of Genetics, by the former department chair of genetics at Stanford. Well, this guy says that his companies are valued at over $6 billion, right? And that he has been able to commercialize, things from his lab by branding himself in a particular way and by associating with people like Tony Robbins, apparently. And all of this is part of the culture that Stanford encourages, right? Because professors often are investing in the companies of their students, because they're spinning out their own startups and they're making huge amounts of money off of it. It's I ran into my computer science professor the other day in front of Main Quad, and he's driving up in his Porsche, and he's just like, "Oh, hi Theo, what do you think of the PSAT?" And this is a culture where if you are in the right fields, if you're in engineering or medicine, and pretty much only those two, you can make a huge amount of money as a professor, and that tends to be your focus more than anything else. At least for some people.
And by doing that, it also removes some of that credibility because the money starts wagging the dog. I remember I was meeting Andrew probably about 7 years ago, and one of the things he said to me, which didn't really make sense to me until I read your book actually, and he went on this long diatribe at how the only way to, if you're going to identify the next trillionaire, you have to be sure that the person is under 18. And I was like, what? And
That's
that
amazing.
would have been in 2017 when he told me that. It was like how to invest. And that's obviously never a question that I ever worried about before. All right, let me ask you another question.
The data dispute that. And that's a big
Mhm.
thing, is that we've built this whole ecosystem around identifying these teenagers and courting them and trying to get them to drop out. And it's pretty silly, because if you look at the data, actually, the most successful entrepreneurs in general in the aggregate tend to be older. If you look at the most successful companies that are spun out of Stanford, they tend to come from graduate students. And this is something that John Hennessy was talking to me about in an interview we did. John Hennessy is the reason for a lot of this no borders relationship. He was the president of Stanford between 2000 and 2016. He was a pioneering computer scientist, by all accounts, a brilliant figure. And he is the reason that Stanford and Silicon Valley are so intertwined at the moment. Mark Andreessen calls him the godfather of Silicon Valley, and he, I think, is still to this day the chair of the board of Alphabet, the parent company of Google and all of its assorted tentacles and whatnot. And what Hennessy was saying is, look, we've built up this mythology around the founder, and kids come here and they think that dropping out like Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates is the most brilliant thing. And the data don't support this. And there are hundreds of people on this campus who think they're going to be, create the next great AI company. And sure, maybe one will, but not hundreds, right? And so we've sold these students on the idea of a system that doesn't function in the way that it, sort of professes to.
So one of the reasons why you're talking to me, maybe the main reason why we're talking at all, is not that you're just a normal Stanford student, right? A 17 to 22-year-old kid who goes to this school. It's because you also broke a giant story, like a behemoth of a story, on the president of Stanford publishing fraudulent results. And there's two parts of this question. The first thing that I just want to say is that you had giant balls here. Like you went in there and you were called like you're a fucking menace. And as an investigative journalist, I myself get legal threats probably once a month, right? I get somebody coming to me saying they're going to sue me, blah, blah, blah. But I'm a 40 something, 40, holy shit, I'm 47 years old and I've taken this for a long time. You're a 17-year-old kid going in there and becoming a micro celebrity at first on Stanford for breaking it in the college paper, and then becoming sort of a national figure when this story really breaks out into the world. How how did you embrace that personality and that side, and what how do you feel like that affected you and your life trajectory?
Yeah. Well, I really didn't want to be a journalist. So this was all a very strange year for me. I came to Stanford thinking that coding and computer science was what I was going to do. I fell in love with Stanford when I was 7. And I remember I just remember seeing this picture of these kids in their t-shirts and their flip-flops, and they're lounging in the shade of a palm tree, and they're leaning up against this self-driving car they just helped to build. And I just
Mhm.
thought, like, the coolest things in the world are happening out there, and I want to be part of them.
Mhm.
When I arrived, I joined the student paper, mostly on a lark, and also to feel connected to my maternal grandfather, who had just passed away right before I started at Stanford, and had not been a journalist himself, but really talked about how much he loved being on the college paper at his own college. And so I joined, and I just thought I was going to start reporting some stories for fun. And I thought that this would be, sort of a low stakes side commitment. And, I discovered, and I think you probably know this better than I do, that journalism more than anything else is a temperament, right? Are you
Mhm.
going to be the person who sees the thread dangling there and wants to pull it to its conclusion wherever it leads, without fear or favor? Are you going to be the person who wants to know something and isn't going to sit around and wait for someone else to give you the answer? You're just going to get off your ass and dig. And I discovered that I was temperamentally very much enjoyed getting to do journalism. And a couple of my stories early on in freshman year led to this tip, which ultimately developed into a dozen stories about Mark Tessier-Levine, and a hell of a lot of reporting time.
And it ultimately resulted in the president of the university leaving. When I
Yeah,
go after billionaires and things like that, I feel like I'm protected because I have the First Amendment and I have a legal strategy for how to deal with people and that sort of thing. But I've never done it from the directly to the company that I'm working for, which is essentially what you were as a Stanford
yeah.
student. How does that make you a target on campus?
Look, it was a really weird position to be in, obviously, and I was warned off the story a number of times. Mark Tessier-Levine is this incredibly successful, incredibly brilliant neuroscientist. And I actually, I want to take a second here and make clear that, like, he's not like Elizabeth Holmes in the sense that he really did do some excellent work. So Mark Tessier-Levine is no fraud in the sense that he is, a towering scientific mind. It's just that there were these lingering papers, these questions that had not been asked at various points when they should have been asked, apparently, that ultimately, led to the stories that I reported on. And so I was warned off this story a number of times by different people that, that they will come after you. I was told that, he is very powerful, that, colleagues of his told me that he, despite presenting this extraordinarily buttoned up and sort of controlled avatar to, the public, that he had this sort of vituperative side to him.
Mhm.
And um, I think it was clear pretty quickly that there was a story here. Once that was validated by the people I started working with, who were forensic image analysts, and confirmed some of the early things that I reported on. And once that became clear, like, as a student journalist, there's no higher calling than reporting on your administration and on facts that might be relevant to your community. But it became super uncomfortable because I just arrived on campus. I reported this first story about Mark Tessier-Levine before the end of my first quarter at Stanford. And so he begins sending out, by winter quarter, these missives to all of the faculty. And so that's all of my professors. And he's lambasting my reporting as breathtakingly outrageous and completely and utterly false, is a direct quote from one of the messages. And he hires, the chair of Cooley, the chair emeritus of Cooley, which is sort of the dominant Silicon Valley law firm. And this guy was the former counsel to Charles Keating Jr., the SNL fraudster, and to Elizabeth Holmes. He was represented her in a class action lawsuit. And he begins sending me these messages trying to, these aggressive legal messages trying to stop future reporting from coming out. And at the same time, there are professors who are telling me like, oh, I support what you're doing, but I can't be seen with you in public. And these are people I'm trying to like talk to about my classes that I'm just taking as a 17-year-old. And so it was a really weird position to be in. But ultimately, I was really lucky that the student paper became independent 50 years before I arrived. So I had the editorial independence and pro bono legal counsel through the paper, and that enabled us to keep going.
So with the work on Tessier-Lavigne, he'd faked some Western blots. For people who want to know more about this whole background, I have a piece on scientific fraud that I'll link to right here. But essentially, you were looking at PubPeer, this sort of citizen journalism, citizen science. I want to say regulator. That's not the word for it. This watchdog, and these people finding not only Western blots, which are a certain type of evidence that's produced in biological sciences, as well as statistical anomalies and other things that show up in this work. How bad would you characterize the fraud? Not only existing, but what effects did that fraud have on, say, the development of therapeutics?
Mm-hmm. So what my reporting ultimately showed was that at various different institutions where Marc Tessier-Lavigne had run labs, various researchers under his purview falsified results in various ways, and that at multiple instances when when errors were brought to his attention, Marc Tessier-Lavigne did not avail himself of opportunities to correct the scientific record. And ultimately, in the view of the Stanford investigation that ultimately, followed up on my reporting, they concluded that he had fostered a lab dynamic that tended to result in rewarding the winners, and that is the people who could produce the data he wanted, and marginalizing the losers. And that, of course, is not a dynamic unique to Marc Tessier-Lavigne, although, of course, they concluded that the repeated occurrence of manipulated data and substandard scientific practices was, unusual in terms of how it resulted from his lab. The most significant paper that I reported on was this famous 2009 study. And this study effectively had claimed to identify the cause of Alzheimer's disease. So this was a huge study. This was a really big deal because people have spent so long trying to understand this disease, and the amyloid hypothesis that remains the dominant hypothesis now, has been for 30 years, has not resulted in a really successful treatment yet. And so Marc Tessier-Lavigne, who is an expert in neurodevelopment, not in neurodegeneration, appeared on the first go around to have established finally, the brain, the binding within the brain that causes neurodegeneration. So this is a huge paper. What my reporting discovered was that even before the paper was published, there were internal results at Genentech, the large biotechnology company where he was eventually served as chief scientific officer. There were internal results even before it was published that showed that the central finding was at best unreliable. This was not mentioned when the paper was published. They used it as part of their annual shareholder statement. They used it as part of a presentation about why Roche, which was the giant pharmaceutical company acquiring Genentech at the time, should actually pay more for the company, because here was an example of the excellent research they were doing. My reporting showed that an internal review was opened up 2 years later, and that the paper could not be replicated, and that Marc Tessier-Lavigne was urged to retract it, and that research into the drug that was supposed to have emerged from this initial research was canceled based on the internal review, that Marc Tessier-Lavigne refused to retract the paper at that point, did not do so until over a decade later after I finally reported on the paper.
Which, of course, goes back to the very question about fraud at Stanford in general, because the way we began this discussion, we were talking about how students were incentivized to pitch successful companies, not necessarily on the results, but on the success. And the venture capital is the acquisition of capital is the primary factor. And, Tessier-Lavigne has now gone on to form, not only make tons of money on these products this science that didn't pan out, that was based on fraud, but he's now starting new companies. What are your feelings about where his career is going now?
So as I report for the first time in this book, Marc Tessier-Lavigne was ousted unanimously by his own board of trustees. And this was a man who began the year, by the way, with one of his signature accomplishments. He created the first new school at Stanford since 1948, the Doerr School of Sustainability, with $1 billion donation from the venture capitalist John Doerr. By the end of the year, he's forced out. But that's not the end of the story, right? 6 months later, 6 months after he is forced to resign because the trustees view his, in their words, view his conduct as unbecoming of a president of the university. They specifically faulted him for failing to correct the scientific record at various points, and also for the very highly aggressive public posture he took toward my reporting. 6 months after this, he raises the largest seed round in the history of biotech, more than $1 billion for his new company, riding the tidal wave of funding for anything AI, because his new company is going to use AI for drug discovery. It's a very fascinating thing. I think it's sort of the perfect kicker to this story, which is about, look, once you're in the system, you're in the system.
Yeah. I mean, in some cases, I've spoken to many noted fraudsters. One of them, Dave Asprey, biohacker, inventor of coconut in your coffee and all these other things, who told me that if you don't have a mark against you, you're not going to be as successful, because that fraud is actually something that people value, or at least at the very minimum overlook. It's sort of like you took the shot, and even if you missed, you can still take more shots. Um, all right, and I want to pivot just a little bit. I know we only have about 15 minutes here. You seem to have had access to some pretty amazing people while you were there, right? Yeah, at one point you drop a line where you're saying, "I was texting with Sam Altman," which is not something a lot of people get to go do. And you're going to these parties and things that are funded by Peter Thiel. What did you? And I could just. The question is, what is your experience of interacting with these sort of super tech oligarch baron people in the world? Like what do you see that's different from them in private versus
Yeah.
public?
Well, so I interviewed Sam Altman for the book, and it was interesting what he said. Sam Altman dropped out of Stanford in 2005, which was the year that I was born, and he told me, right, that when I was there at Stanford, he says that none of this sort of stuff happened. That this VC circuit, where the same kids are accessing all of these perks and going to all of the same parties and texting with all the same billionaires for advice or whatever, that didn't exist 20 years ago, and that actually it might be, he said, in his words, a quote unquote anti-signal, which is a tech bro way of sort of saying that things, might actually not be a good sign. That actually the people who are really good at self-presentation, might not be the ones to create the successful companies. Which I think there's some sound logic to that for sure. But it's striking, right? Because what's happening here is the attempt to replicate the success of a system that was until very recently a very different place. Stanford still likes to think of itself as an underdog, right? That this is the place where renegade outsiders are building for the sake of it and creating new technologies that are going to reshape the world. It's not an underdog anymore. It is a powerful institution with a reputation to protect. And these students, they're not just building for the sake of it, right? The thing that you work on in your dorm room on the weekend goes on your resume. The hacking sessions have corporate sponsors, right? So it's become formalized. And the jury's still out, really, frankly, as to whether or not it actually will be successful, whether or not this actually is a good recipe for producing successful companies. I think that there's, reason to believe it might not be, but this is a place where students come in understanding the myth. That this is a place where, just down the hall from where I took my first Weeder computer science class was the Hewlett Shed, which is a replica of the little shed in which Hewlett and Packard built their business with $538 in 1939. And now it's sat inside the glass and steel 136,000 square foot Huang Engineering Center. It's the myth that's been corporatized. It's, you come in understanding that the frat guy who wanted to send disappearing nudes to a girl, became the world's youngest self-made billionaire by creating Snapchat. That the two kids who started by having food delivered to their dorm became billionaires by creating DoorDash. That kids understand this is what they can do and what they're supposed to do.
One criticism of your work that is out there is that you obviously the work is great. The type of research you've done, the level and quality is something that you see someone producing who's much senior to you. You were 17 when you were doing this. It's amazing. One of the criticisms, however, is that you are a product of nepotism, right? Your parents are two very, very well-known journalists. You went to Phillips Andover, which is, the Bushes both went there. You have this very elite, you have this very elite
Yeah.
background. How do you reconcile, that sort of the benefit, the advantages that you've had with
Yeah,
the
yeah, of
results of your
course.
work?
Yeah, no, look, I'm super lucky. I would be the first person to say that, like, I have very cool parents that I look up to and admire and are far more interesting than I will ever be. Um, Part of this is why I wanted to go 3,000 miles away from home and study computer science, right? And make out my own, successes or failures and figure things out for myself. I'm certainly lucky that I've had two great role models to look up to, who establish a baseline for what good journalism can look like. But obviously, nothing really prepares you for being a 17 and 18-year-old, like reporting on the president of your school. And like, there's not a lot of overlap between research misconduct and Silicon Valley and what my parents report on, which is politics. So, I had a certainly a leg up in that I was immersed in the milieu. Like, I understand, sort of what journalism looks like. And the main thing is that you just keep asking questions and you just keep going. But in terms of like the actual work itself, they obviously weren't like reporting my stories for me or writing them or anything.
Mm. It does seem that you certainly benefited from just being in that milieu growing up, because I
Yeah, for
wasn't
sure.
asking questions in the same way when I was 17. To,
Yeah.
now you really do have that ability to follow through and a dogged determinism, which usually takes a little while to grow. So it's a great benefit that the way you've put this together is really, really impressive.
Well, I would also say that, right, like, there's only one way to learn journalism, and that's by doing it. Like, you can't learn it in a classroom, and you can't really learn it from watching other people do it. It's you learn it by this is the thing is, right, like, we always end up talking about the big stories, which is important, right? Those are the ones that matter. But in some ways, it's the little stories that matter most because that's how you get the big stories, right? These things don't exist in a vacuum. I only reported on research misconduct because I first reported on college parties and, like events and a guy who was pretending to be a student in a dorm, for a year, who didn't actually enroll at Stanford. And so it's, there's really only one way to report, and that's by reporting. Um, you know, and I actually look, I do hope that people who read the book will find something. I don't know. I mean, I fell in love with journalism because it's just such a cool thing to be able to do. I know it's not like a popular like sentiment at the moment, but the ability to like just ask questions and like be empowered to like, that you as a 17-year-old, like you can directly determine whether things that are important for your community to be known will be known. That is an incredible thing. And I feel so fortunate that I had the place to do that at the Daily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we do need more examples of journalists going out there, fight truth to power, going out and doing great work that changes society, because the unfortunately the PR flacks and the corporations that are out there who want to undermine journalism have done a great job of it in the last 30 years, where they've made journalists look like crooks, when in reality we're not generally the ones who are getting paid amazing salaries for
Yeah, yeah,
for
exactly.
fraud.
No, and
um,
it's also funny that, right, like I think a lot of people just don't know journalists, right?
mhm,
Because if you look at the numbers, I- and I believe this is still the case. I know it was the case 2 years ago. McKinsey, the consulting firm, employs more people than there are journalists of any kind at any publication covering any topic in the entire country, right? And
mhm,
so there's just not that many of us, and I think that's a problem, right? Because if you care about something, you want it to be better. And
mhm,
that has always been the perspective from which I report on Stanford, right? I stayed. I put out this book before graduating. I'm proud to have been able to go to Stanford, and I met so many people I love and adore. And if you want something to be better, you have to ask the tough questions. And
mhm.
I think that sort of mentality is part of why Stanford has had so many problems in the last few years. That hasn't been willing to ask some of the tough questions of itself.
So where is it? Where are you going next? You've put this book out. I'm looking at the back of it. I see Amy Pascal blurbed it, and she's the former chairperson of Sony Pictures. So I'm assuming there's a movie deal. Where is the direction that you're going to take your career? Because you're still like what, 21, 22.
21,
Where
yeah.
does your life look like from here?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the first priority is just like getting the book out and, having conversations like these about it. I want, to make sure that I'm spending the time to really like talk about what this means with people, and why I think it's important that, this small little cluster of the world with so much control over all of our lives, right? Technology controls everything about society right now. Technology. So sorry. Oh my gosh.
No worries.
Technology governs everything about our lives right now. And technology flows through here. And it is controlled by a very small slice of people who operate in a very unaccountable way. So I want to have that conversation. I haven't really figured out what's going to come next, but I'm sure in some way it'll revolve around storytelling and journalism.
Well, awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for being on the show. And this book was fantastic. It's also an audiobook. You read it yourself. I actually did both. I had to get it really quickly. So I was audiobooking and I was reading it. It's a great defense of journalism and inspiring journalism book. It shows that we really can make some differences in the world. So, I appreciate you so much coming on the show.
Thank
And
you.
people can find it on all the places you usually find things. Just Google it in and they'll send it to his place. But he has a website and all that other good stuff.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for talking about this stuff.
Thank you so much to my supporters here on Patreon and on Substack and even on YouTube who make this work possible. It means the world to me that you're here. And if you want to get your name on the honor roll, all you need to do is sign up at the links down below. From Foxtopus Inc. in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Investigates.